Alright, so today we'll be going over a segment of the Declaration of Independence. So Thomas Jefferson wrote that the history of the present King of Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations. So let's define injuries in this context. He's accusing the king of harming the 13 colonies in some way. And to usurp means to take away something a person has a right to have. All having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. So, due to these grievances consisting of harmful acts and violating colonist rights, states are suffering from the king's absolute tyranny or oppression. I can reasonably predict that repeated injuries and usurpations are probably forms of grievances or complaints made against King George, but what does Jefferson mean by them? Let's go over the first few grievances in the Declaration. So in the first line, it says, "He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good." What does assent mean? Assent to laws, and why was it necessary? So, in defining assent to laws, first of all, assent means an expression of approval. So, assent to laws in this context refers to the king's right to approve or reject laws. Since he was refusing to approve laws considered necessary and for the public good, we can infer that public good could consist of things like expansion of rights, economic well-being, and civic welfare. In line 2, it says, "He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance." Why were laws that needed to be passed immediate and pressing importance? Well, there was no internet, planes, or phones back then, so requests for the king's assent and his replies could take months crossing the Atlantic in ships. Lines 3 and 4. "Unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly rejected or utterly neglected to attend them." How was the king neglecting the colony's needs? Well, he struck laws down whenever they went against British interests and eventually prevented colonial assemblies from passing their own laws entirely. This is significant because the colonies were granted charters to govern themselves. A big part of self-governance was to create laws to manage things like local elections, colonial trade, and relationships with Indians. But why did King George act this way? How can I make sense of this? Let's look at it differently from his perspective. He believed that if colonists were allowed to self-regulate these issues, they could start fights with their neighbors, namely Spain or any one of the Indian tribes, pulling Britain into expensive conflicts like the French and Indian War. They could also disrupt tax collecting efforts or initiate trade with competing countries. Such rights could encourage the American colonies to push for more liberties that could eventually lead to an independence movement all by itself. The idea of an independent nation in the New World, however, much less a democratic republic, was an unprecedented and historical event. The major European powers up to this point were all led by monarchies that ruled their countries with absolute authority. King George was no exception and believed he was exercising his divine right to maintain order within his colonial domain. All of this potentially undermined the king's authority and thereby the perception of British imperial power throughout its overseas colonies and with its rivals in Europe. So in line 5, he has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people. Jefferson is referring to the colonial territories or states like Virginia, New York, Quebec as large districts of people. The king disallowed locally elected representatives to form their own legislative governments unless they relinquished their rights to lead it, in which case the king would automatically assume the head of that government anyways. In lines 6 and 7, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. So let's define relinquish. As a prefix re, which means again, the root Latin linquere, to leave. It means to voluntarily surrender or give up something that you already owned or had. Jefferson was stating that only tyrants like King George feared the right of self-governance and the reason why that right was inestimable for their freedom. So let's define inestimable. It has a prefix in, which means negative force, the root estimate, which means rough calculation of number, quantity, and has a suffix able, to do. So it roughly means something that's too great to calculate or priceless. Alright, so before we move on, I want you to imagine you're a straight-A student traveling by horse to school, going 3 to 4 miles per hour in freezing temperatures for 12 hours with no heater. At the end of your journey, you realize your homework and notes are back at home. You're dirty and exhausted from the trip, but go to class anyways. Teacher reviews the previous day's lessons, but you don't have your notes, so you have difficulty following. When it's time to turn in your homework, your teacher gives you a choice. Receive a 0, ride all the way back home to achieve your homework, or write an essay after class on that day's lesson. Now I want you to think of this mental image and take into consideration of what your choice would be, and keep in mind of your choice when you read lines 8 through 10. So I'll leave the next few lines for you guys to analyze.